Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. City Club is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Greg McPherson, president of City Club. Members and guests are gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are AARP of Oregon, McKinley Irvin, Iberdrola Renewables, Airbnb, and Uber. Please join me in showing our appreciation for all of them. Over the past 10 months, a City Club research committee has analyzed some really difficult questions. Should Oregon raise the minimum wage, and should Portland's wage floor be higher than other parts of the state? At next week's Friday Forum, a panel will discuss these questions. The discussion will be informed by the City Club research report released yesterday. The report recommends that the City of Portland take steps to set a higher local minimum wage and that the Oregon legislature allow it to do so. We will hear from the panel during the regular hour, after which City Club members will debate and vote on the research report. Members who do not attend the debate and vote will be emailed a ballot. Online voting will be open until the following Monday. City Club is currently accepting applications to participate in advocacy for the report's recommendations in the event the club adopts them by a sufficient majority. Learn more about advocacy around this issue at cityclub.org/minimum wage, and please join us here at the Sentinel next week for this provocative topic. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. Later in today's program, our moderator will facilitate a Q&A session with those in the live audience. Asking questions at the microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, but anyone here in the live audience at the Sentinel may write a question on one of the index cards found at the center of the tables. Hold the card up and City Club staff will collect them before or during the Q&A session. And now for today's program. Is the Columbia River Gorge a scenic wonderland or a crucial commercial corridor? Can it be both? Oil companies are proposing to build the largest oil-by-rail terminal in the country at the Port of Vancouver. Hundreds of jobs would be created, but environmental and neighborhood groups oppose the project. Today, we'll hear from both sides. Jared Larrabee is general manager of Vancouver Energy, an oil industry company developing the proposed terminal. He has worked on the establishment and operation of oil terminals elsewhere in the Northwest and across the country. Michael Lang has served as conservation director of the Friends of the Columbia River Gorge since 1995. He serves on the executive committees of the Power Past Coal and the Stand Up to Oil coalitions and leads the Friends' efforts to stop coal export and oil by rail terminals in the Northwest. The remarks from these opposing viewpoints will be moderated by the Oregonian's reporter on the environment, Rob Davis. A former investigative reporter for The Voice of San Diego, Rob Davis has won state and national awards for his coverage of oil trains in the Pacific Northwest. Please join me in welcoming Jared Larrabee, Michael Lang, and Rob Davis to City Club.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. We appreciate this opportunity to be a part of the dialogue and what's happening. I am here representing Vancouver Energy, which is a joint venture between Tesoro, Refining and Marketing, and Savage Companies. Before I go into the specifics of the project that we're proposing, Vancouver Energy, I'd like to provide some market context and a brief overview there of the West Coast market and what's happening, and then the U.S. energy landscape today, and how the Port of Vancouver, where our project is proposed, became a part of this entire discussion. So first of all, starting with this region, all of the refined products, petroleum products used in this region today come from outside of the region. They come here by vessel, they come here by rail, they come here by barge, and they come here in some instances by truck. They come here from Washington, from California, and in some rare instances, even from Asia over here. For reference, or as a reference point, in the Portland area, there's over 6.4 million barrels of storage capacity for refined products. There's 9 terminals that make up that 6.4 million barrels, and there's also 5 wharfs or docks for petroleum products up and down the river today, mostly to the west of the Portland market. So the U.S. liquid fuels market is a key enabler of our economic growth and development, both here in the region and across the country. So all of these petroleum products that come here come from crude oil. And where does that crude oil come from on the West Coast is a critical component of this. Well, today we import 40% of our crude oil on the West Coast from foreign sources. That's roughly 1.1 million barrels of crude oil a day. And over time, we've continued to increase our reliance on those foreign sources for that crude oil. Now, in the same time, over the past 6 years, our North American production and our American production of crude oil has increased by over 3.2 million barrels per day. Most of that oil is found in the mid-continent of the United States. So what have been the impacts of building facilities like this in other areas? On the East Coast, they've been able to displace foreign crude oil imports by 50% by building facilities like what we're proposing. On the Gulf Coast, they've virtually eliminated all imports of light sweet crude oil because of this crude that we're producing today. The West Coast doesn't have a facility like this and hasn't been able to take advantage of that same opportunity, and that's exactly what we're proposing. So how did the Port of Vancouver come into the picture here? Well, over the past 15 years, the ports and the communities in the area have invested $190 million in deepening the Columbia River channel. It's designated as a federal maritime highway, and that investment has gone into, and the purpose of that investment has been to increase trade and increase infrastructure along the river. At the same time, the Port of Vancouver has invested over $275 million in rail infrastructure. The purpose of that infrastructure has been to remove trucks from the road, to increase break bulk services, and to reduce rail congestion in the area and specifically around Vancouver. These two investments are what make the Port of Vancouver the closest deepwater port to mid-continent crude oil with new rail infrastructure and the ability to move that to the West Coast refineries. So the Vancouver Energy Terminal and what it is, it's a state-of-the-art purpose-built facility. It uses the latest technologies and controls, and it provides one basic function, and that's the transfer of crude from rail cars into vessels to deliver to the West Coast refineries. It will take up about 3% or a little less than 3% of the port's properties. It's 3 miles west of the I-5 bridge and about 15 miles west of the closest point to the Columbia Gorge scenic area. So earlier I mentioned our reliance on foreign crude oil and how this plays into that. Vancouver Energy has the potential to displace 30% of the crude oil that we import from foreign sources today. We anticipate that a majority of that crude oil would come from the Bakken field. And one important point around Bakken crude oil is that it has a lower carbon intensity than the typical crude oil used on the West Coast today. For example, if you were to replace the crude oil used in Washington with Bakken crude oil, it would be the equivalent of removing 250,000 cars from the road solely by changing the source of crude oil that is used. So this is not about increasing fossil fuels, but it's more about displacing the sources that we use today. We've often mentioned that this project and this infrastructure is a bridge to the energy future. And President Obama actually, in a recent address, talked about a similar type topic. He said that as we transition to these renewable fuels, our economy is still reliant on oil and gas. And with that being the case, it's better for us to rely on our domestic production than foreign imports of crude oil. He also emphasized the need for that to be done safely and to use the best safety standards in doing that. And those are the best safety standards found in the U.S. So today sure we're going to hear about two distinct safety topics, one being our terminal, where we're investing $45 million, or nearly 20% of the estimated budget for the project, in safety, health, and environmental mitigations, protections, and concerns. We're committed to doing that and committed to continuing to make sure it's built and operated safely. The other is the rail transportation to the terminal. There's rightly concerns about the rail transportation to the terminal and the safety of the rail transportation along the right way. And in fact, we are 100% aligned on making sure that that is done safely and that the safety is increased along the way. That's why our partner Tesoro has invested in the newest rail cars that exceed the current federal standard. It's why we're making sure to work with firefighters and other emergency responders and train them, both us and the BNSF. It's why the BNSF is investing $6 billion this year alone on rail infrastructure and improvements along the rail route. It's also why we've been supporting state and federal legislation that is balanced and that is moving towards more safety and increasing that safety. We believe that investments that are being made today not only benefit the project we're proposing, but benefit all the rail that has been moving for over 100 years and all the commodities that have been moving for over 100 years, and increases the safety for the entire region. So today, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic for a couple reasons. Specifically, I'm optimistic about where we're moving with domestic crude oil production and the ability for us to become more energy independent and have more energy security. But more generally, I'm optimistic because we have an opportunity to have a more balanced portfolio. We continue to improve in efficiency, and we continue to reduce the environmental impacts. And all of this is allowed as we bring investment in infrastructure and the related jobs that come with it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Michael Lang, and I'm Conservation Director for Friends of the Columbia Gorge. I also serve on the Executive Committee for the Stand Up to Oil Coalition. The coalition's mission is to stop companies like Tesoro from endangering our children, our communities, and the Earth's climate with massive oil-by-rail terminals. The Columbia River Gorge is a national scenic treasure. It's an icon of the Northwest. The gorge that you see today would not exist but for the efforts of thousands of citizens and leaders who worked tirelessly to pass the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Act in 1986. But today, the Columbia River Gorge is facing its biggest threat since the passage of this landmark legislation. Crude oil shipments by rail through the gorge and massive oil terminals in the Columbia River and throughout the region are a threat not only to the gorge and to the region's inhabitants, it's a direct threat to the core values that make us proud to live and work in this region. The dramatic upsurge increase in oil extraction in the Bakken region of North Dakota has resulted in a 57-fold increase in oil by rail. This is all very new. Starting in 2013, just 2 or 3 oil trains a day, each carrying 3 million gallons of oil, began traveling through the gorge. Now more than a dozen proposals for oil-by-rail terminals are pending throughout the Northwest, including the largest oil-by-rail terminal in the United States, Tesoro's Vancouver Energy project. If approved, most likely all of this oil would be transported by rail through the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. These terminals would far exceed the refining capacity that's currently available in the region. Tesoro would transport an average of 15 million gallons of oil per day by rail cars to Vancouver. From there, oil tankers would travel down the Columbia River, crossing the dangerous Columbia Bar, destined for domestic or perhaps foreign refineries. If Vancouver Energy and all other terminals proposed in the Northwest are approved, 100 oil trains per week would travel through the Columbia River Gorge. This would convert the Columbia River Gorge from a national scenic area into a national oil pipeline. This is especially alarming in light of the oil train derailments and explosions that have shaken the country over the past 2 years. Bakken oil is extremely volatile. Over the past 2.5 years, there have been several oil train derailments and explosions throughout North America, which have killed 47 people, cause the evacuation of thousands more, and cause billions of dollars in property damage and environmental destruction. An oil train accident, spill, and fire in the Columbia River Gorge would be devastating to its communities and to the environment. Transporting crude by rail is inherently unsafe. Several recent explosive train accidents have actually involved the newer rail cars, the same cars that Tesoro had previously called safe. Now Tesoro says it will buy 200 upgraded tank cars, but these tank cars puncture at speeds as low as 12 miles an hour. These trains would pass by our schools, our daycare centers, homes, and businesses every day, endangering our children and our communities in places like the Columbia River Gorge. The blast and impact zone from an oil train explosion would cover most of the towns along the rail lines. That's why firefighters from across the region oppose Tesoro's terminal, because they would be unable to respond to a spill and ensuing explosion and fire. And Tesoro, understandably, likes to talk a lot about safety, but in addition to the documented dangers of transporting oil by rail, Tesoro has a terrible safety and environmental record, such as causing the deaths of 7 employees at its Anacortes refinery just several years ago, to millions of dollars in fines for safety violations and pollution at its facilities. Public opposition to Tesoro's oil by rail terminal is intense, and it's growing every day. The City of Vancouver, 101 Vancouver businesses, firefighters, unions, tribes, and hundreds of elected officials oppose this terminal. The majority of local residents are opposed to this project. In addition, on November 4th, the Portland City Council will hold a hearing on 2 resolutions opposing any increase in oil by rail through this region and opposing any new fossil fuel infrastructure in Portland that isn't geared towards improving safety. This month, the Washington Attorney General's Office released a scathing rebuke of Tesoro's draft environmental review of the massive terminal, finding that Tesoro ignored many key environmental and safety laws. So now Tesoro wants to limit public review of this environmental impact statement by releasing it just before Thanksgiving and closing the comment period right after the holiday season ends. Happy Thanksgiving, by the way, and Merry Christmas. We're left wondering what Tesoro was trying to hide by doing this. So we call on Tesoro today to wait until after the holiday season to release its draft EIS and give the public 90 days to review and comment on this massive proposal. So to learn more about this oil terminal, please go to our website. It's gorgefriends.org, or visit standuptooil.org to find out more about what you can do. Thank you.
Good afternoon. For those of you who are just tuning in on OPB, I'm Rob Davis here at City Club's Friday Forum discussing oil by rail with Jared Larrabee of the Vancouver Energy Project and Michael Lang of Friends of the Columbia Gorge. So let's talk a little bit of context first. 8 years ago, almost no oil moved at all in rail cars. Fast forward to today, and between 10 and 18 mile-long trains are moving through the Columbia River Gorge each week, carrying millions of gallons of crude from the Bakken Formation in North Dakota. This is oil that fuels our economy, fuels our cars, but it's also introduced the risk of catastrophic oil spills into areas that Oregon and Washington leaders have never planned for. So, Jared, let's start with you and answer Michael's question. This EIS is coming out right before we all sit down to the Thanksgiving table. Will you agree to a delay?
So I think it's important to start out by talking about what's happening with that process. So the permitting process is run by the Washington State Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council. That council, or that process, is designated as a one-year permitting process. We've been going through that process for about 26 or 27 months at this point in time. Our request related to the DEIS was actually that they make sure they deliver that before the holidays a long time ago. And the FSIC Council is the ones who set the deadline for when the EIS would be released. And they set that deadline back in July and planned for that in their review. We likewise are impacted by a review of that process over the holidays. And so we have that similar impact. But the fact is that the review of that has been delayed significantly, and so we believe that it's fair and appropriate for that permitting agency to maintain the timeline that they've put out there. Their responsibility, according to the legislation or the statutes that put that in place, is to do a thorough review, but to also do it in a timely manner. And so we believe both of those need to be balanced in there.
So let's step back just a little bit and talk big picture here. Oil train traffic in the Pacific Northwest has dropped slightly as the price of oil has collapsed. Oil is notorious for boom-bust cycles. Is Bakken crude just the flavor of the month? Is crude by rail here to stay?
There have been a number of industry reports that actually have indicated that it is here to stay. It is something that is here to stay long term. If you look at the West Coast in particular, there are no pipelines to deliver crude oil to the West Coast. So the need to have our domestic crude oil on the West Coast is there, and it's the only way to get it to the West Coast today. So it is here to stay, and while the prices have fluctuated, really, if you look at why that's fluctuated and what's happened there, it's been because the world markets, and in particular OPEC, has not cut their production in order to try and cut us off from producing our oil here domestically. Well, the result of that has been the low gas prices that we're seeing here today through that oil. So we do believe it's here to stay, and with American ingenuity in business, the cost of producing crude oil will go down, and they'll adapt to that, and then we'll continue to produce that oil.
So again, setting some kind of baseline expectations and understandings here, can you tell me a little bit about the project's role in the supply chain on the West Coast? It's capable, if it gets built out to the 360,000 a day barrel capacity, of moving more oil than Tesoro's refineries in the Bay Area and Anacortes process each day. So where does all the oil that would be coming through here go, and what source does it actually displace?
Yeah, so the 360,000 barrels a day is the size of the facility and what it could handle. The way that the joint venture is set up is Tesoro is actually a customer of the project. And I do want to clarify and point out that there is a distinction between Tesoro and the joint venture, which is Vancouver Energy. Savage will be the operator of Vancouver Energy in that mix. So Tesoro would be one of the customers, but the intention is that this actually has the ability to serve the entire West Coast market, which includes all of the refineries up and down the West Coast, not just Tesoro. That's an important distinction because there is the market for that. We do get questions as well about the size of the facility at 360,000 barrels a day, and the reference that it's one of the larger facilities in the country. That is true, but in many other areas around the country, what they've done is built 3 or 4 facilities that share a facility fence. Now, what's the impact of that? Each one of those individual smaller facilities only has to plan emergency response or their capabilities around the size of their individual facilities. So what we're building here is a custom-built, state-of-the-art facility that is designed to handle the market need, can displace 5 of the other smaller facilities that are proposed with 1 facility, and is designed to handle from a capabilities and emergency response exactly what is needed versus something smaller than that.
So for somebody who's not in the oil business, explain to us why a refinery wouldn't simply build the rail capacity on their site to have one of these trains go directly there. Why does a train need to stop in Vancouver, have the oil sucked out of 105 tank cars, put on a barge, sent down a river, down the coast, up the coast? What's the point?
All of the refineries on the West Coast today receive their crude oil by vessel, by ship, mostly from foreign sources, or 40% from foreign sources. So the refineries are already set up to receive it that way. At the same time, their infrastructure around the refineries, they're essentially landlocked with neighborhoods and other pieces of infrastructure around them. So you could try and build that, but it's not as efficient, and it's not as economical, and frankly, it's likely not as safe. It increases the rail miles that it's traveled, and decreases the chance of getting it to them on the water the way they have typically received that, and how all of the safety and emergency response plans have been built around that today.
So, Michael, let's bring you in. In this region, we drive around, we use oil, our airplanes use oil. It's got to get here somewhere, or somehow. How would you prefer, if not by rail, that it get here? Pipelines have accidents as well, as we've seen in the Pacific Northwest. So what's the answer?
Well, the answer is to not approve this terminal. This terminal is not needed, and at the same time, we're talking about a massive increase in transport of oil to the region that far exceeds the region's refining capacity. Actually, oil imports have gone down by about 25% over the last several years, and oil exports from 2008 to 2013 doubled. So building another terminal on the Columbia River, and really, think about it, this is a major shift from the way Oregonians and Washingtonians are used to its Columbia River. We haven't seen anything like this before, so it's really precedent setting. We don't need this terminal at all, but we need to think about reducing our reliance on fossil fuels here. We have created an economy that's essentially addicted to oil. And when you have an addiction, you don't feed that addiction if you want to get off of it. Does the alcoholic benefit from building a new huge bar in the corner? Absolutely not. We should be looking at reducing our consumption of fossil fuels, not increasing it. But again, I really have to go back to the fact that what we're looking at, Tesoro is nearly half the size of the Keystone XL pipeline. If you combine it with the other terminals proposed in the Northwest, it's in excess of 1 million gallons per day. That's about 25% larger than Keystone. Our current refining capacity in the Northwest is far below that, 25–30% below that, about 730,000 gallons per day. So where is this going to go? I mean, it's not going to go here necessarily. It's going to go to California. But let's be realistic. This is potentially an export terminal. And I think the question for Tesoro that it should be prepared to answer today and every day too is, let's say the export ban is lifted tomorrow, and there's a lot of interest in Congress to lift the U.S. crude oil export ban. Will Tesoro export crude oil to Asia or elsewhere? I think that's a really important question that we need to answer today. And then also, if the terminal is to receive tar sands oil from Canada, it's not subject to the export ban. So essentially, tar sands oil could be shipped by rail to this terminal if it's approved, and then not subject to the export ban, be shipped right out to Asian markets. And then I would argue, and I think that our friends would argue as well, that this is not the Columbia River that we want to see in the future. It's not the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area that we fought so hard to protect, essentially becoming an oil-by-rail pipeline to California markets or to foreign markets.
You want to respond to that, Jared?
If I can remember some of the points. So, yeah.
Just to the point of, is this a terminal that will see oil exported to foreign markets through it? You've said that it's not designed to do that. It's not part of the business analysis that's gone into it, but it's certainly possible, isn't it?
So let me answer that very directly, that we designed and built the business case related to this terminal 2 years ago, and I would never personally build any business case based on the federal government changing a future law. And President Obama has also said if there is a lifting of that ban in Congress, that he would veto that ban. So I think it's a moot point, frankly, to talk about that.
So if it's a moot point, would you pledge today to all these people here that the terminal won't be used to export crude oil at any point in the future, even if that ban is lifted?
I think that it's important that we look back at what's happening in our country and what we're doing today. Today, we have an economy that continues to increase its use of domestic products as we come out of an economic recession. And in fact, as Michael pointed out, we have reduced our reliance on foreign crude oil. And the way that we've done that is by the use of our own domestic crude oil. That's how that's all to come about, us using that domestic crude oil. So I don't see that is the market for this. The market for this is the West Coast refineries and serving the needs that we, each of us in here today, produce by using the refined products that come from that crude oil.
So, Michael, since oil trains started moving in this country, we've reduced foreign oil exports by nearly a third. Shouldn't we be encouraging development of infrastructure that allows us to continue cutting subsidies of foreign oil producing states?
I think we need to reduce reliance on fossil fuels across the board. And it's, and no disrespect, but I think it's a little bit of a false question. What we're focused on is whether this Tesoro terminal belongs on the Columbia River, and whether one of our greatest national assets and an icon of the Northwest, the Columbia River Gorge, should be used to transport massive amounts of fossil fuel. It's also a question of community safety, too, and I'll have to go back to the safety record of transporting oil by rail. It's extremely dangerous. There have been many lives lost, and property damage and environmental destruction in the millions of dollars. We're concerned about the impacts to communities all along the rail line. We're particularly concerned about the impacts to the community of Vancouver, who is solidly opposed to this project. So I think we can do better than this, and many of our members and residents of the Gorge who oppose this terminal think that we can do better than this. By building a terminal on the Columbia River, we're not only endangering our communities and our special places, but we're also going the opposite direction we should go in. We're increasing reliance on fossil fuels. We ought to be looking at clean energy, electric vehicles, and making sure that we reduce consumption of fossil fuels.
So, Michael, to riff on the point that you've made, that the Gorge is going to become a national oil pipeline, haven't we already made the choice as a society that the Gorge is both a vital industrial and recreational corridor? There are dozens of trains that move there today, carrying far more dangerous things than oil. So haven't we already made this choice?
Well, first of all, it's a game changer. When you look at the 100 oil trains a week, if all these terminals are approved, and then in combination with the coal export terminals that would transport 100 million tons of coal per year through the Columbia River Gorge and open coal cars, it's a marked shift. But I do want to address this head on. In 1986, Washington Senator Slade Gorton, who co-sponsored the National Scenic Area Act, in his floor speech talked a little bit about the railroads. And he said that although railroads are not considered an industrial use, they are subject to the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Act. And he went on to say that the operation, maintenance, and expansion of rail in the Columbia River Gorge cannot adversely affect the scenic, natural, cultural, or recreation resources of the gorge, and that any adverse impact should be avoided or mitigated. So that was the decision that was made back in 1986, was that no, rail and transport of goods by rail through the gorge do not get a free pass. They're subject to the purposes of the Act, which are to protect and enhance the scenic, cultural, natural, and recreation resources.
So, Jared, let's talk about safety. In the last 3 years, oil trains have exploded with what to me has been surprising regularity. 47 people died in July 2013 in Quebec. Then an oil train crashed and spilled hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil in Alabama, a giant fireball in North Dakota, another fireball in Virginia, in West Virginia, in Illinois, again in North Dakota. So what can you do to make sure that that doesn't happen between your terminal in North Dakota and along the rail line where many of these people live?
So I think I'll just start out by saying I live in Vancouver with my family, and I'm equally concerned about that safety from a personal perspective and making sure that it's done correctly. So when we look back at what's happened and what's changed, we as the terminal operator also, we operate, or we can't operate or generate any revenue or have a business without it being delivered safely. So fundamentally, we want it being delivered safely as well. We want our employees to be safe, we want the communities to be safe, and we want the environment to be safe as well, because we live here as well and we enjoy those areas as well. So I mentioned the investment in the rail cars that our partner Tesoro has made. That's one thing that we can do to assist with that. I mentioned the support of the state and federal legislation, the holistic legislation that looks at the broad system and how to improve the broad system. Those are absolutely critical, and we have supported those and will continue to support those things. We believe that the system has come a significant ways since a couple years ago, and it continues to move that way. We've had federal regulators that we've invited into our terminals in North Dakota, and we've asked them to look at our systems and make sure that it's safe, and we've also worked with them to make sure that we are sharing the best industry practice across the industry and not just keeping it within our control or within our systems. That's all good. That increases the safety for everyone along the transportation route.
So for those of you who are just tuning in on OPB, I'm Rob Davis here at the City Club Friday Forum discussing oil by rail with Jared Larrabee of the Vancouver Energy Project and Michael Lang of Friends of the Columbia Gorge. So Michael, on the safety front, what are they missing?
So the question is, what is Tesoro missing on the safety front? Oil by rail is inherently unsafe, and if you look at the cars or tank cars that were pledged to be used as CPC 1232s, which I understand Tesoro is moving on from, but they still use. In the span of 1 month, there were several accidents in North America of these very same rail cars exploding at as little as 20 miles an hour, derailing and then exploding one after another, causing the evacuation of hundreds of people, oil spilling into waterways and riverways, and emergency responders cannot go near it. The only thing that they can do, and whether you talk to Skamania County Fire District or the Firemen's Union in Vancouver or the State Fire Chiefs Association of Washington, who called for a moratorium of oil by rail, is they can't respond. Our emergency responders are telling us, this is so unsafe, we cannot protect you. So I would pose a question to Tesoro, who should we believe? Our emergency responders that are saying, we oppose this, folks, this is unsafe, you don't want this in your community, or the assurances of Tesoro that unfortunately has demonstrated time and time again that it cannot operate safe facilities, that it will not comply with environmental and safety laws. It has been fined millions of dollars for violation. It has barred safety inspectors from even going into the terminals to do an assessment on whether or not they're complying with safety rules. This is all documented. So I guess what I would say is that given the demonstration of this company and its terrible safety and environmental record, and also our emergency responders and experts telling us oil by rail is unsafe, you don't want this in your community, the only choice is either really for Tesoro to withdraw, or I think for FSEC and the governor of Washington to deny this proposal.
Jared, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll respond on a couple of fronts related to that. I first want to clarify again, this is Vancouver Energy. There's a distinction between the two. Savage, I come from the Savage side of the joint venture, and we work very closely in looking at who our partners are and look at the safety record of those partners and whether or not they are operating safety. And we feel comfortable operating with Tesoro and working with Tesoro. So I think that's an important point to make. Savage will be the operator of this terminal. Savage in 2011 was named one of America's safest companies. Savage earlier this year, received a Workplace Safety Award from the Association of Washington Businesses for the work we do unloading crude oil safely in northern Washington. So I want to just emphasize maybe that point, that there's an intention, seems like a view of trying to pull in some things that aren't necessarily relevant to the discussion here and what we're talking about. Now, in relation to the emergency response and the firefighters, one of the things that we asked FSEC to do and to look at in the environmental impact statement was a gap analysis between what we are proposing at the terminal and the emergency response there and what the firefighters had. And then once that, if there are any gaps identified, that we can work on defining how to address those gaps. So I believe that most of this actually is something that comes out as part of the environmental impact statement, the reviews, and it's part of the permitting process to look at how to do this. That's one of the reasons we have these robust permitting processes here in the region, is to make sure that these gaps are identified and that they're looked at in a fact-based way and in an analytical way. So we're looking forward to that environmental impact statement coming out so that that can happen.
So let's talk tank cars for a minute. The railroad industry voluntarily improved the design of the tank car that today is hauling crude oil in 2011. You said that you'll only accept those at your facility. Earlier this year, the federal government tightened tank car standards, coming up with something, and forgive me, it's called the DOT 117. Newer, stronger. So will you only accept DOT 117s at the facility, or will you continue to accept the 2011 slightly less safe tank car until it goes out of service in 2025?
So we'll absolutely comply with the federal standards related to that. And I think it's also important to point out that there's still a significant amount of time before this terminal would be up and operating. So there's a lot of evolution that still needs to happen related to that.
So then just to be clear, you would continue allowing CPC 12 of 32 cars as they're known. These are the tank cars that were voluntarily proposed by the rail industry in 2011. You would continue allowing those at the facility until the federal government pushes them out of service in 2025.
I would say that I can't necessarily comment on that because we don't know the timeline of when we would receive permits and the construction would be done. So as it relates to the federal timeline related to that, it's difficult to say yes or no on that until we understand that a little bit better and how the two may interact with each other and interplay.
Michael, I saw you at the edge of your seat there. Was there something you wanted to add?
Actually, I was just trying to listen to Jared's response. It's a little, the acoustics are a little weird over here, so it's hard to hear his response.
Okay.
So, but yeah, I've got about 10 minutes of things to add. No. At your peril, you asked me that.
So, Jared, the Vancouver City Council, the fire chief in the city, and the firefighters union there have all opposed the project. Do you think that they've gotten something wrong about the project? Do you see something about it and the benefits of it that they don't?
Well, early on when the city council was discussing that, what we asked the city council is to let the permitting process proceed and to allow that full and robust analysis to happen. And after that, what happens at that point in time. So we've really encouraged them through that to make sure that they're including that. I do think I want to point out, throughout this whole process, we've engaged third parties. DHM Research is one of them to do third-party polling. Our intention of those polls are not to try and sway people or persuade people. It's to get an independent third party that's respected and to understand what the true public sentiment is. Now, consistently, Over the time that we've done those polls, more than 2/3 of the folks in Clark County have demonstrated support for the project. Similarly, we've done statewide polls, and it's very similar numbers. The support for the project is very high.
So we're going to have to leave it there. We're going to open up the Q&A portion of the program. If you've written a question on an index card, please hold it up high so City Club staff can collect it from you. And we'll take questions from the audience now. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their questions. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership. Membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less, and I will read at least one index card question when they come up to me. So please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Barbara Smith-Warner. I am a City Club member and also an Oregon State Representative from Northeast Portland. And I just wanted to throw out, if it's not entirely adjunct to this discussion, that here in Oregon we did pass some legislation in the session this year, House Bill 3225, which establishes a central emergency response system in the state through the Oregon State Fire Marshal's office that had not existed before. And this was something that we came to by working collaboratively between the railroads, particularly UP and BNSF and the State Fire Marshal, in response to a fire marshal's report of, indeed, there were huge gaps in the emergency response system as it was set up in the state of Oregon. So I'm not sure, I don't believe that Washington has a similar system, but I did want to make sure to comment on the fact that we have established this here in Oregon, and it is starting up as we speak.
I'm Jim Chase, a City Club member, and I have a admittedly softball question for Mr. Larrabee. I'd like you, sir, to come visit the gorge with me for a day as my guest. Please bring your family if you would like. Come see the gorge through my eyes, through the eyes of millions of people who live there and visit there every year from all over the world. There's no place on earth like the Columbia River Gorge. It's beautiful, it's safe. If your terminal is built, derailments, spills, and fires are inevitable. You know that, I know that. They will destroy great beauty, families, communities, a struggling economy, and a way of life. Before you make that decision, you should at least come see the consequences of what may happen if the terminal is built. So, Mr. Larrabee, will you join me for a day as my guest in the gorge?
I would absolutely do that. I spent actually last Friday with my kids hiking the Eagle Creek Trail. We get up in the gorge as often as we can to see that area. Earlier this year, actually, I spent a weekend camping on Sand Island on the river as well. I love the gorge, and I want to protect it as well. I do want to make a comment. One of the things that we say frequently at Savage is zero occurrences is an achievable goal. That absolutely is an achievable goal. Tesoro, for 30 years, has operated their terminal at the Port of Vancouver with 0 spills and 0 occurrences. For the last 2 years, we've been operating their facility up in Anacortes with 0 spills. That's the standard that we set when we do these things, and the standard that we will always be working for. But I absolutely would join you in the gorge.
My name is John Daggett. I'm a new member of the City Club and also a new member of Columbia River Keepers. The Columbia River Keepers have given me 9 very poignant questions, and you've been hashing most of those over, so I have picked one out of the air. Jared Diamond wrote the book Collapse, and I couldn't synthesize that better than to say, our Native Americans want to make decisions that are 7 generations out. I asked both of the panelists to look at the global impact, long-term 7-generation impact. Do we do a terminal or not? And I'd like both panelists to respond to the 7-generation issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, too. And I appreciate the perspective and the tribal perspective, and our society needs to be a little better about looking 7 generations ahead. We can protect the gorge in our communities looking 7 generations ahead, starting right now. And that's by transitioning away from a fossil fuel economy towards a clean energy future, and making sure that we don't endanger our communities by transporting oil by rail, whether it's through the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area and its communities, or anywhere along the rail line from North Dakota all the way out to Vancouver and ports in Washington. So we can start today looking ahead 7 generations by denying terminals like Tesoro and the others and moving away from our reliance on oil. Thank you.
So I appreciate the question, and I agree we do need to be looking further out down the line with to our next generations and 7 generations out. So maybe to make a comment, if we look at transitioning to biofuels or to other liquid fuels different from crude oil, what type of infrastructure are we going to need for those? We're going to need tanks, we're going to need pipes, and we're going to need rail cars to transport that. So we can delay investments in infrastructure, or we can make those investments in the infrastructure that we need. There's also I believe, a false dichotomy out there that we can't have economic development and growth and protect our environment. I believe we can have both. We need to do it safely, and we need to do that in an environmentally responsible way. But we can have both. We can look at both of those. So I look at this as an investment in infrastructure, something we desperately need in this country that serves us for many generations to come, regardless of the product that's moving through there.
Steve Seymour, City Club member. I work in Portland, but I live in Mosier in the Columbia Gorge. I routinely use Amtrak Empire Builder to commute to work and back. When the oil trains spiked, Amtrak service was severely disrupted from my personal experience. That's been smoothed out, but if the proponents prevail, I anticipate some serious problems with passenger rail traffic through the gorge. What do the proponents intend to do to prevent passenger rail schedule disruption?
That's probably a question that is better addressed by the railroad than by us. And the reason that I say that is we rely on ratable delivery and reliable delivery of products to us just the same as everybody else. So when there are impacts on the railroad, then we feel those impacts equally, just like everyone else. And so we actively will work with the railroads to make sure that those impacts are addressed, or that there aren't impacts related to that.
I'm Bill Harris, a City Club member. I didn't quite understand the 2 statements made regarding the view of the residents of Vancouver, Washington, regarding this installation. It seems that I heard from each of you, but the data was not the same. Can you somehow resolve that between you so we can all hear it again? What do the people of Vancouver, how do they stack up regarding this issue?
Well, it's very well known the City Council and the City of Vancouver itself is opposed to this proposal. There are 101 businesses in the City of Vancouver that are on record opposing the proposal. Early in October, a poll of likely voters was fielded in the Port District. So it's located on the Port of Vancouver property. So the Port District both elects port commissioners, and they also get taxed by the port. The majority of people in the port's tax district, most affected, closest to this proposal, oppose this project. And I recall the numbers were 51% opposed, 39% in favor.
So I live in Vancouver. I am there on a regular basis meeting with people, and I can tell you anecdotally that I hear support all the time in talking that. Now, separately, the polls that we did were conducted by DHM Research. They were conducted similarly that was not likely voters. I believe it was voters in Clark County. And it's a different polling district than it sounds like this was doing. And those polls came back at 69% supportive of the project.
Just to add my own answer, the proponents' polls show that people want it. The opponents' polls show that people don't want it. There is a port election coming up for port commissioner in the next few weeks. One candidate strongly supports the project, one strongly opposes it, and if you're looking for a referendum on where people stand, I would look to that as a pretty good indicator when that happens.
You mind maybe adding one other comment? There actually have been other polls that have been conducted. OPB conducted a poll about a year and a half ago, and their question wasn't specific to our project, but was asking whether or not crude could be transported safely, and that one did show support as well. And then there was one that had another. There have been 3 different ones that I'm aware of that have been done.
Mark Gamba, Mayor of Milwaukee and City Club member. There are several small communities that the trains will be passing through, and given the catastrophic nature of a pretty likely fire, and given that the only supply of the foam that's required to fight such a fire exists at the Portland International Airport, how do you propose that these small towns fight a fire like that, and do you intend to supply them with the foam and the equipment to fight such a fire?
So we've already actually invested almost $1 million in emergency response equipment that is up and down the river in Pasco, in Wishram, and in Vancouver. And we don't have a terminal yet, but we've made that commitment to that investment, and we'll continue to do similar types of things as we proceed. So separate from that, there is already the transportation that's happening, and the BNSF Railroad does have foam in place throughout the gorge, and a number of the shippers of refined product also have those assets in place up and down the gorge and in the river.
And I just want to respond to that too, that emergency responders and fire districts in the Columbia River Gorge say there's only one response to an oil train accident, fire, and explosion, and that's to evacuate immediately. And regarding Burlington Northern, their hazardous materials director last year at a safety forum in White Salmon, Washington, was asked what would the response be if a train derailed and oil was spilled in the Columbia River. Its response was we would let it float down to the next dam and try to collect it there. And no one asked follow-up, well, what if it's below the Bonneville Dam and there's no dam to actually stop it? If it did float down to the dams, it's likely it would get into the fish ladders and turbines, causing hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. And I would ask, who's going to pay for that? Tesoro, Burlington Northern, Savage, or the public?
So I can't comment on an anecdotal comment that someone has made, but I again will come back to the reason that we have environmental impact statements and to look at that is to move to a fact-based analysis and do things in a fact-based way and have an opportunity for people to comment in relation to those facts. We support the process that we're going through. It's a very thorough and robust process. I'm sure if there's impacts that need to be identified, that those will be identified in that document.
Rob Rostov, City Club. I live out in the gorge. I live in Cascade Locks. From Wyeth all the way down to Multnomah Falls, we have the only fire department to cover that side of the gorge. We have 2 firefighters. They have to cover that area 24/7 by 365. Doesn't work real well. In addition, we have our pavilion, which has weddings, and we have a school very close by.
The tracks are in terrible shape, and I'm wondering, have you even given any consideration of what those tracks look like? Thank you.
So I'm going to come back to a statement that I made earlier that we rely on safe transport of the product as well. So all of these issues that are being brought up related to the transport, we have the same concerns. We're aligned on those issues and making sure that it's done safely. And we absolutely will work with folks to make sure, from our perspective, and how we work with the railroads and others to make sure that it's done safe. I do think it's important to point out that hazardous materials, stuff that is extremely dangerous, moves through the gorge today. So isn't it great if we improve the system so that all of that stuff can be transported safely? And it's not just focused on one product or one commodity. The reality is investments in our infrastructure, investments in improvements, and taking a hard look at projects like this make the entire system safer and better. And we think that that's a good thing.
And I just want to remind everyone, if there's an oil spill and accident, it's not over that day or the next day. As we've seen with BP and with Exxon, the environmental and economic effects of these oil spills go on for years and years and years. And I'd just like everybody to think about, whether you live in Cascade Locks or you like to hike in the gorge or you're a tribal fisherman, what it'd be like to see an oil train hit a rock from rockfall, derail, and spill and catch fire. You would feel the heat from miles away, and that fire would be unstoppable, rivaling something like the Yakult burn in the early 20th century. So think about it.
We've run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. This is Greg McPherson, President of City Club. Please join me in thanking Jared Larrabee, Michael Lang, and Rob Davis for a spirited discussion. We are adjourned.